Fair enough. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about least risk Monte Carlo estimation of enterprise risk, and it connects to, for those of you who've been in the room when Eduardo presented, it connects to various topics that Eduardo mentioned. So what I'm going to try to do, because I figure, given the given that this is sort of like cross-disciplinary conference, I was going to give a brief introduction in the problem and talk a little bit about risk estimation, enterprise risk management, and so Eduardo in his talk mentioned valued risk. I'm going to sort of talk about valued risk and what the background and valued risk is. I'm going to talk a little bit about the difficulties in calculating valued risk for financial institutions, which is one of the big challenges that they're facing. I'm going to propose a new algorithm that's sort of built around sort of analytics ideas, so essentially regression ideas, and apply it to this estimation problem. And so the key contribution of this paper, and it's going to get a little esoteric, so I'm going to bore you in advance, is about the optimality of the basis function. So it's essentially when you design this regression approximation, the question is how can you do this in a reasonable way? So how you choose the regression functions, and here you can use certain properties of the underlying probabilistic model to come up with optimal regression functions. And I'm just going to show you that works really well and conclude with that. All right. So. When people talk about risk-based capital requirements, there's a relatively easy way to think about this. Right? So if you think about a company, right? So you think about a balance sheet, right? So on the asset side you have what you have, and on the liability side you have what you owe, right? Does that make sense? And so like newer financial regulation systems, including Solvency II in Europe. In the U.S., the NAIC Solvency Modernization Scheme for insurance companies, but also with Basel II or Basel III or Basel 3.5 for banks, essentially have taken a view in the future. So it's not sufficient to only have enough money to cover the present value of liabilities right now, but you need to have enough money to also be able to, given uncertainty over the next year or so, be able to cover your liabilities in the future, right? So rather than thinking about your current asset position and your current liability position, you're forecasting your balance sheet, say a year or so, and you're looking at your future value of assets, given your investment strategy, and your future value of liabilities, given your depositors and given your contract portfolio, right? So the difficulty here is that you're not wondering whether you currently have more liabilities than assets, but you're thinking about a risk horizon, right? In insurance, that risk horizon is typically 1 year. You have a 1 year perspective. In banking, it's shorter. Like banks typically calculate 2-week VARs, right? So you're thinking about market movements over the next 2 years, right? So you're thinking about these financial schemes essentially give green light to the financial institutions if the present value of liabilities exceeding assets is a low probability event, right? So I'm choosing 0.5% here, which is the value that a lot of banks, a lot of insurers use, right? So if you think about tau being 1 year, this means you need to have enough cash so that default is a 1 in 200 year event, roughly, right? I mean, so because your default probability is bounded from above by half percent. Now, if you tool around with this a little bit and you just subtract your liabilities from your assets, then you get something that people call available capital. So you can think about this probability of liabilities exceeding assets as simply being the probability that your available capital is negative, so you don't have any capital available, right? And you can add your current capital on both sides here, and then you get something that in finance typically is called sort of the loss at the time horizon for the financial institution. So in the end, what you're calculating, you need to make sure that you have enough money now, so that your loss exceeding the money you have in hands is less than a 5%, than a 0.5% event, right? So again, you need to have enough cash now, so that the chances of you going bankrupt are less than 1 in 200 years, right? And so if you want to calculate this, right, you essentially have to calculate a quantile of this distribution L here, right? So here, this is probability L greater than C0, which is nothing else than a survival function. So you're calculating the survival function at 0.5%, so you're calculating a quantile, right? And in finance, this quantile is typically referred to as the value transfer, right? You guys with me, roughly? All right, cool. All right, so the difficulty in this calculation problem, right, is that you have this this risk horizon in here, right? So you have today, then you have this risk horizon, right? But what you're interested in is essentially the present value of your liabilities and your assets at this risk horizon, right? So if you now think about a complex asset side, where you have, you know, non-standard securities and maybe you're a bank and you're selling derivatives and whatnot, right? It might be difficult to assess that market price. So you might have to use models for assessing that price. Similarly, for an insurance company, the present value of your liabilities, how much your obligations are worth, right, is not something you can just read off, but it's something you have to calculate model-based, right? So essentially, what you're facing is this nested simulation structure. So you're standing today, you forecast what the financial market does until your risk horizon. And then at the risk horizon, you have to evaluate all your assets and all your liabilities, right? And the difficulty here, and this is sort of indicated by this graph here, is that you have this nested simulation structure, right? So if you do this in sort of like a Monte Carlo way, and Monte Carlo here, for those of you who don't know, just refers to simulating essentially, right? So if you do this in a simulated manner, right? In order to get a good view of what the market does over the next year or so, you have to simulate a lot of scenarios, right? So again, you're trying to get your fingers on something that's a 1 in 200 years event, right? So if you want to evaluate a 1 in 200 years event, you need at least simulate 10,000 years to have a good feeling of what a 1 in 200 years event is, right? Does that make sense? So 10,000 is a reasonable number here, right? But then in each of these scenarios, so each of the future evolutions of the market, you have to evaluate your assets and your liabilities. Evaluating your assets and your liabilities, again, is something you typically do based on simulations, right? If you do this in simulations under market applied probabilities, right? You again probably want to use 1,000 to 10,000 simulations, right? And the difficulty here is that if you have 10,000 times 10,000, right, is a lot, and a lot gives a hell of a lot, right? So the difficulty that financial institutions face is that this nested simulation structure typically sort of expands their numerical capabilities, particularly because essentially what you have to do here to get your future cash flows is writing for you the entire balance sheet, right? So if you think about legacy systems, right? So you have to sort of predict cash flows in banks or insurance companies, right? These are all the systems that are so if you feed them with one scenario to calculate minutes to hours for each scenario. So if you have to calculate 10,000 squared scenarios, that's a lot of calculation. And this is sort of like an older problem, and people, smart people, Mike Gordy from the Federal Reserve Board, and Mark Brody from Columbia University, and so on, have written about this, and I have a couple of papers on that too. And what I'm proposing in this paper, this is related to what some other people have done, but we're contributing sort of like the approximation, is essentially saying, well, maybe you don't need to run a lot of simulations based on every scenario, right? So maybe you can borrow information from this path that is relevant right here, right? So and that might seem a little strange at first, right? But I mean, so you can sort of think about this as a regression problem, right? So you can think about the cash flows being uncertain future realizations, and you're trying to determine your cash flows, the conditional expectation of your cash flows, based on your market outcomes at time tau, at your risk horizon, right? So one way of tackling this is, rather than simulating, you can just simulate a small number of red paths, and then use the red path across all scenarios to run a regression on the outcomes at the black scenarios, right? Does that make sense? So rather than simulating nestedly, right? You're simulating linearly, but then you use a regression technique to borrow information for this black path from all the other black paths, right? Does that make sense? So that's a relatively well-known approach for pricing derivatives, right? So the least squares Monte Carlo approach to pricing American options is something that's been around for a decade, but it hasn't really been used in risk matter evaluation, right? So the idea here is, and you're making use of this approach. And again, a couple of other people have thought about this as well. And one thing that I should mention is sort of like, and we started working on this, the early, maybe 2009, 2008, and sort of starting in 2010, a lot of insurers in Europe that were faced with calculating solvency capital requirements actually took this algorithm. So this is something that now a lot of insurers use. So I guess it's been quite successful. One issue that they're facing, though, and this is what this paper addresses, is in this regression approximation, right? So when you're thinking about approximating your conditional expected value based on your future realization, you have to choose your functions for the regression approximation, right? And so one of the things that I hear when I talk to insurance companies, also banks that are relying on this approach, is how do we choose that regression approximation? And they use polynomials, or sometimes they use splines or something like that, right? But essentially they go to the typical toolbox of function approximation, and sometimes that works well, sometimes it doesn't work well, but they don't really have a good handle on why this works well. And so what this paper addresses is essentially is a robust way of choosing this function approximation. That's where all of this gets a little esoterical, and I apologize in advance for that, right? So one thing you can do, given that all you want to do is calculate conditional expectations of those red paths, conditional on the outcomes right here. So if you write this as a conditional expectation, you can take an operator perspective on this conditional expectation. So essentially, you can think about an outlying stochastic process driving the economy. So think about YT, a process that includes interest rates, stock prices, inflation rates, but also firm-specific variables such as think about, firm-specific balance sheet variables, right? So you can think about, equity is a derived thing, but maybe you can think about sort of market penetration. You can think about demand indicators and so on, right? And based on these demand indicators and the macroeconomic information, you're forecasting these cash flows. Now, these cash flows mathematically are nothing else than functions conditional on these realizations, right? So once you know what your demand is, once you know what the market does, right, you can predict your cash flows. That's essentially what this says right here. And all of this information is given, right? So so at the end of the day, what you need to do is nothing else than predicting a conditional expectation xj, the conditional expectation of a function xj of your future world states yj. Now, if you do this, and this is sort of like the key innovation of this paper, you can think about this as an operator, and that operator maps cash flow functions to your current market realization, right? So the way we're thinking about this is that different companies might use the same model, right? So think about the model being fixed, but different companies have different cash flows, right? So if you're Century Insurance versus AmFam Insurance, right, and you might be differently affected by changes in the economy, right? Just because you have something differently, you have different asset positions, right? So maybe AmFam made some risky gambles, and Century was conservative in their investments, right? But also on the liability side, right? So maybe think about think about a typical life insurer. So Sentry has some life business relative to MetLife, right? MetLife sells these crazy variable annuity contracts, right? And these crazy variable annuity contracts expose them to risk, whereas Sentry sells whole life policies. So you have different your demand side is affected differently as well, right? So thinking about this as an operator, this question, and I'm gonna skip a whole bunch of this because we'll skip all of that. Skip all of that. Taking this operator perspective, and you're facing nothing else than what people in function analysis call an operator approximation problem, right? So you can essentially think about your regression problem as an operator approximation problem, right? And so if you guys are familiar with matrix algebra, right? So let's sort of think about this in finite dimensions, right? So an operator in finite dimensions is nothing else than a matrix, right? Does that make sense? So when I say operator here, an operator is infinite dimensional because you have path here and you have continuous distributions, which makes this all a little iffy. But you can think about this just in finite dimensions. So you have a matrix, and the matrix maps a vector into another vector, right? Does that make sense? So a matrix is a finite dimensional operator, right? So the question you're having here, we reformulated this problem to a operator approximation problem, right? So the question you're facing here is essentially, hey, can I write down a lower dimensional matrix that approximates my higher dimensional matrix in an optimal manner, right? And this is, for those of you who've taken an algebra class, right? This is a well-studied problem since like the 1950s, right? And the answer is that the best low-rank approximation to a high-rank matrix is a singular value decomposition. Right? So the idea here, by having sort of this whole thing in an infinite dimensional infinite dimension setting, right, is that you can use sort of the exact same ideas, right? So a high dimensional matrix is approximated as a low rank approximation by the singular value decomposition. Here you have an infinite dimensional operator, but in the same way, if you want to approximate the infinite dimensional operator, you can approximate it by its so-called singular value decomposition, right? And sort of what this says is that that you get, if you define basis functions that provide the best functional approximation, right? It turns out that the singular values are the ones that do the trick. And this is sort of interesting. If you think about the convergence properties for your regression approximation, you can prove that the convergence properties for your regression approximation converge faster than any other choice, right? So you can sort of like show optimality in terms of regression, right? All right, what does that mean? Let's look at some pictures. Let's look at some pictures, right? So I'm choosing an example here from insurance, right? Because someone knows what I'm talking about here. So I'm looking at sort of complicated life insurance contracts, and it's not so important to understand the details. And I'm thinking about a setting where you have three things that are stochastic, right? So I'm thinking about stochastic interest rates, and I'm thinking about demographic uncertainty, right? So people might live longer or might live shorter, right? So I have mortality risk. And I'm thinking about a risky stock market, right? So I'm putting down this model using a Brownian motion, as Eduardo indicated, actually using three Brownian motions that are correlated to model the financial market, right? And then I'm trying to calculate this valued risk, as you've seen on the second slide, based on this least square and Monte Carlo approximation, right? And so the first thing here, so M4, 5, 6, and 7 refer to the least squares approximation, and the black line is the exact nested simulation approximation. And the bottom line of this picture is just that it seems to work if you choose enough basis functions, right? So if you only choose 4 or 5 basis functions, you see that distribution is sort of far away, right? If you choose 6 or 7 basis functions, you seem to be doing quite well. And this sort of like shows essentially the same results in a table form. So essentially, what this says is that so these are all statistical deviations, so statistical divergences. So essentially, if this number is large, it means that the true distribution and your approximated distribution are far away from each other, whereas if that number is small, it means that your approximation is good, right? And I mean, and what you see here is that, like, take, for example, the Kolmogorov divergence or the Kolmogorov-Smirnov distance. Your Kolmogorov-Smirnov distance becomes substantially smaller as you use more data and as you use a high-dimensional functional approximation. Now, all right, thank you. The second thing, and this is sort of the point of this paper, is on the right-hand side, you have monomial approximation. So this is sort of industry standard, where you run this regression approximation using polynomials, right? So you use the stock price, the stock price squared, the stock price cubed. You use the interest rate squared, and then you use maybe interaction terms like stock price times interest rate to have that regression approximation. Whereas on the left-hand side, you see the singular value approximation. So these optimal basis functions that we derive based on the operator approximation, right? And so essentially what you see here is that that number is always smaller than this number, right? So bottom line is that you sort of the singular function approximation beats the monomial approximation out of the water, right? So this works heck of a lot better. And you can also look at this in terms of graphs. So here on the maybe let's go to this graph right here. So here what you see are valued risk figures and Kolmogorov divergence. For monomials, those are the white boxes, and the singular values, which are the optimal approximations, right? And so here for the Kolmogorov divergence, a small number is better, right? Because then the difference in the distribution is smaller. And what you see is that including additional terms for the polynomials makes you a little better, but not substantially better, whereas the singular value approximations always do better, and substantially so, starting at m equals 10 or something, right? So these approximations work a heck of a lot better, and you can also see this when you calculate the valued risks. And now I'm going to comment on that in a second, right? So what you see that for the valued risk, the monomials seem to be consistently biased, right? So this is the true value, the black line here, the ground truth, and this is the approximation, right? So you seem to be consistently biased. That bias, there's a little bit of a bias here, but that seems to go, that goes more and more away for the singular value proposition. You can still see, and the y values are quite different, right? So if you calculate a 99.5% VAR, and I think this is based on 3 million simulations, you're still pretty far away, or potentially far away from the ground truth, right? And this just illustrates you calculating a 1 in 200 years event, and calculating a 1 in 200 years event is a difficult job, right? Does that make sense? So because you're tossing essentially the majority of your simulations, because only very few simulations are in the tail, right? So you're actually approximating, not based on a lot. So if you run this several times, you get quite a bit of variation. But nonetheless, you see, given that you have to, if you have to take a stab at it, the singular value approximations are getting a lot closer, right? So what I tried to tell you is that if you think about calculation of enterprise risk via risk measures, right? And there's difficulties associated with the traditional approach of calculating them. This was this nested simulation structure, right? Just because a lot is a heck of a lot, right? So that's sort of like the thing to remember, right? You can use regression approximations, and there's also people who started using machine learning for this, and that comes with its own types of words. You can think about regression as just one simple way of machine learning, right? I mean, so you're just constraining your functional approximations. So machine learning is more flexible, but, and that's the advantage of the regression approximation, in the regression approximation, you can take advantage of your knowledge of the problem, right? So what we are taking advantage of here is that we know about the underlying simulation process. The underlying simulation process allows us to calculate and see the values of the corresponding valuation operator that essentially maps future realizations to capital levels, and taking into account that information improves, number one, provides dramatic improvements of the approximation relative to canonical choices, such as Holombic polynomials or orthogonal polynomials. And we're working on this right now. You also beat most machine learning algorithms unless you throw a heck of a lot of data at it, right? So if you use an unrealistic and large amount of data, it's hard to beat deep learning, right? Just because so the function approximation can be arbitrary, but in realistic data situations, the machine learning algorithms tend to overfit, and that's also what these authors find, by the way. So we're not the only people. All right, that was it. Questions, concerns? Go ahead.
I come from a very different background, so I apologize in advance if it is out of. But the idea, I mean, what I'm hearing in the nested approach,
yes,
for you is the ground truth, the gold standard basically. You are comparing against that your new approach.
Yes.
So in both cases, my question would be, which one is actual closer to reality? Is there a way to validate this?
So yeah, so this is, so there's, that's a very good question. So this is not really, so this is more, so think about this not necessarily as a learning problem, but think about this as an experimental design problem, right? Because, in the end, here, because this is based on simulations, you can always generate more data, if you will, right? Does that make sense? So you're essentially thinking about cutting down. So you can always generate more data, so you can get, if you have enough time, the nested simulations will get you to the ground truth, right? Does that make sense? So if you have unlimited computational resources, right, there would be no point in thinking about this problem in the first place, because the nested simulations, all of them will get you to the ground truth because you know they converge in the end, right? Does that make sense? So since your data set is not limited, you can always simulate more data, right? All of them will get you to the ground truth eventually, right? But in realistic situations, given that you have reporting requirements, you have to report those every couple of, banks have to report those every 2 weeks, insurance companies have to report those every quarter, right? Realistically, you don't have unlimited computational resources just because of reporting requirements, right? Does that make sense? So you can think that in a realistic setting, an insurer, right, anything north of 1 million simulations is going to be too much, right? In a nutshell, right? So the question is, conditional on this numerical constraint, conditional on this numerical budget, which of the approaches gets closest to the ground truth, right? And here we know the ground truth because we have time and can wait to evaluate the ground truth. But the question here is, in a realistic setting, which one would get closest to the would get you closest to the ground? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.